why I try and let you know real fast what the situation is. Now,
I was gonna drop it.
you know what? I could tell. I looked at her and I thought, I hope she doesn't get up.
Oh man,
I thought you were about ready to get up and walk
I looked
out.
out, I thought I was gonna fail.
You know, I could tell by your body language that you were about ready just to say, kick this, you know.
I was
And,
cool until you said 50 points. I said, God, 50 points?
Yeah, I know.
I was like, what?
I was like, man.
I said, let me go ahead and get serious for a minute.
Well, I'm glad you're not gonna drop. Thank you. And I'm glad, I did have one person get up one time, and I had to chase them back down.
Messing with this damn paper for a reason. I couldn't say it.
But there is one thing to be said, you know, if you couldn't answer those questions, those are real easy. It might be good for you to go back and review some of these things, okay? Well, we had gotten to this point right here, and today we're going to talk about several things, more things about the nervous system, and then we're going to talk about the brain, okay? Now, you saw the model of the vertebrae that I passed around. You have 24 vertebrae. They are divided into groups: the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar vertebrae, and then you have protection for the spinal cord in the sacral area, and I don't think there is in the coccyx, but you do have those areas, particularly the cervical, the thoracic, and the lumbar, that are comprised of the vertebrae. The afferent and the efferent nerves either come off of the spinal cord or enter the spinal cord. The brain weighs about 3 pounds. It is estimated to have, and I'm going to go and say, at least 15 billion. I'm going to show you a film next week, and I think he says there's even more now. We are going to talk about different areas of the brain, and depending on how we are talking about them, will depend how the brain is divided, okay? We talk about the two halves of the brain being called the hemispheres. We have areas of the brain that we are going to locate structures called the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. Then we talk about lobes in which the different functions of the brain we identify. The hindbrain, for our purposes, is comprised of the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla. The cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla. Now, this is the human brain. This is the left hemisphere. And basically, for the things that I'm telling you right now, you can apply to both halves, unless I tell you something different, okay? Now, this is the cerebellum. This is what's called the pons. This is the medulla. Now, the cerebellum is called the little brain. The cerebellum comes from the Latin word for little brain. It too has two hemispheres, and it has a cortex that also surrounds these hemispheres. Now, in addition to physical movement, We know that the cerebellum also is engaged and actively, it controls impulses. It's involved in language. It is involved in some higher order cognitive processes, as well as movement, balance, and posture. Movement, balance, posture, memory, impulse control, language, some higher order cognitive processes. Now the pons, it connects the hemispheres at the hindbrain level. Okay? Now, in addition to that, it has some involvement in sleep and arousal. Now, when we say arousal, unless I say something differently, we're not talking about sexual arousal. We're talking about consciousness and wakefulness. Okay? The medulla is involved in vital functions, such as breathing, swallowing, circulation, blood pressure, heart rate. Now, in these responses, they say a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. It's also can make you feel very, very helpless, okay? When my mother was hospitalized, she'd been there for several months. And one day I went to visit her and they were just bringing her out of the room, and I said, well, where's mother going this time? And they said, we're going to do a swallow test on her. They said, we suspect that she's having some problems swallowing now. Well, they came back and they said, well, it looks like she has almost lost 100% of her ability to swallow. So we have done a CT on her and we've done MRIs. We can't find out why. She has not had another stroke. She hasn't had anything that we can pick up on that has caused this. And so we're kind of in a quandary, what's going on. My first thought, I hope to goodness this is not the first part of her brain that's starting to shut down. I knew that the medulla was involved in swallowing, and with them not having any indication of an event like a stroke, I just thought to myself, I hope this isn't happening. And actually, it was. It's a very helpless feeling when you see something like that. And even though it's very slow, different parts of her brain did start shutting down. And so, the medulla has a lot to do with vital functions. The reticular formation not only is located in the midbrain, but it has some fibers that go up into the forebrain and some fibers that come down to the hindbrain. Okay? It has a lot to do with wakefulness. Okay? Now, if I give you an example, I think it'll make more sense than if I try to go on and explain medically. In simplified terms, let's say that you go to your cousin's house during spring break. You've had a tough semester, you're tired, you're burnt out, you're toasted, and you want to go there and all you want to do is just catch Z's, chill, and do nothing, just veg, okay? You get there and your cousin says, well, here's the room, just do whatever you want, it's up to you. So you lay down and you go to sleep, and it's not too long before you hear this bong, and you go, oh, that's just a grandfather clock. Okay, good. So you go back to sleep, and a little bit later, you hear the air conditioning come on. And you go, oh, that's just the air conditioner. Pretty soon, you wake up because you hear the refrigerator come on. And you, oh, that's just the refrigerator. Well, the next morning, you go in and your cousin says, well, how'd you sleep? Oh, I slept terrible. I think I'm just not used to the mattress. No, we have a friend called the reticular formation. It's kind of called the gatekeeper of the brain, okay? Now, for a lack of a better way of explaining it, you've got your gates here, okay? When they're open, you're awake. Now, you've gone to sleep, and you hear this bong, and basically the reticular formation says, oh, I'm not sure about that. And they open up the gates, and you wake up, and you say, oh, that's just the grandfather clock. A bit later, you hear the AC. Oh, that's just the AC. Okay, good. Soon, you hear the refrigerator. Just the refrigerator. The next night, it still does that, but the third night, you sleep through. Because now, it's kind of used to what's going on, and it knows you don't have to be alerted, because it's really not dangerous. Those things are okay. So, the thing is though, if something happens and there's some kind of brain damage or accident or something happened, and your reticular formation is damaged, you can remain in a coma forever. For, you know, like we'll just say the gate closes and locks, and when that happens, you're not gonna wake up. And so, we want it to wake up, we want it to open up and let that stuff in. And it is our friend, but we don't want that thing to get injured, damaged. Here it is, it's in the midbrain. And the next thing is the forebrain. Next area is forebrain. It contains the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the corpus callosum, and the limbic system. Now, there are other structures, of course, in the brain. These are the ones that we will be taking time to discuss. All right. Right hemisphere of the brain. The thalamus. Now, medicine, biology, several types of fields, they have words that are prefixes that if you know what they mean, you can pretty well figure out what the rest of the word means. There's a word called hypo. It means either under or beneath. So knowing that, where would you think the hypothalamus is? Under the thalamus, absolutely, here you go. Hypothalamus, under or beneath the thalamus. Here's the corpus callosum, very easy to find. That's one of the easiest structures in the brain to identify. And then the limbic system is on another slide, okay? This is an MRI, lovely detail with an MRI. And again, you can hear, this is so easy. There's your corpus callosum. There's your thalamus, your hypothalamus in there. Pons, medulla, cerebellum. Well, let's call your thalamus the relay system of the body, where we called the reticular formation the gatekeeper. We'll call the thalamus the relay system. say that's your thalamus. Okay? Well, a guy sees a pretty girl, and the information comes into the thalamus via the optic pathway. The thalamus is part of that optic pathway. And when it gets here, the thalamus is going to relay it to a different part of the brain to process it. So this is optic. You hear a song that you really like, brings back, you know, it's your song with your significant other. That information comes into the brain, comes to the thalamus via the auditory pathway. The thalamus relays that information to another part of the brain. Same thing with touch. Oh, I already did hearing. Let's see. Taste. This is gustatory pathway. And it too relays the information elsewhere. There's something significant about what I have just been saying that the observant person might pick up on. Make an observation there.
It's the senses, right?
To what?
Like the five senses or whatever. It's not five, but it's the senses.
Well, we do have five senses. What are you talking about?
Well, there's four.
There's only four there.
Yeah.
Missing smell.
Yeah, it's missing smell.
Sense of smell does not go through the thalamus. It is the only sense that the pathway does not go through the thalamus. So that's pretty significant, okay? Now, the hypothalamus, we call it the pleasure center of the brain. Pleasure center of the brain. It's very powerful. It's very influential. It is the one that regulates your hunger drives, your sex drives, your sleep needs, your thirst. It also has a place in the there's also in the hypothalamus a structure called the suprachiasmatic nuclei. We abbreviate it the SCN. It is responsible for our daily schedule, okay? The SCN, if you get hungry every day around 7 o'clock in the morning, you say, oh, I haven't had breakfast yet, I guess I better eat. That's because of the SCN. What we're talking about is the circadian rhythms, this daily scheduling. If you get hungry around noon, that's because of the SCN. If you get hungry around 7 o'clock at night, if you start getting sleepy around 10 o'clock at night and that you are well asleep by 10:30, that's because of the SCN. In thinking about that, there's going to occur something very soon. Something that very soon is going to occur that's going to interfere with every one of our SCNs, every one of our circadian rhythms. Daylight savings. We go on daylight savings in a couple of weeks. And in doing so, it's going to mess us up. I love it when you get a couple of extra hours of sleep. That's pretty nice. But when it's the other way and you have to give up that extra hour, and, you know, I kind of walk around like a little zombie for a while until I can get used to it, because, you know, I'm deprived of some sleep there. What if somebody has been working 11 to 7 for 30 years and retires and decides to go on a normal schedule like everybody else? It's gonna really mess with them. And it may take them 3 years to adapt, because it is so ingrained. It's been this routine for 30 years. They're just not going to reorient overnight. And so this thing, you know, the circadian rhythm is very important to us. Word to the wise, if you are going to travel east, do not do it during a daylight saving time change. I did that one time. I had to have a conference, and I flew east, and that was the one where you have to get up an hour earlier. So it ended up that I was having to get up 2 hours earlier than I normally was. And I mean, that was just not working well at all for me, you know. And so, again, I was really messing with that circadian rhythm. There's the hypothalamus. You know, I hadn't told you about this kind of neat experiment that they did with some rats with the hypothalamus. They put rats in this cage, and the rats found out very quickly if they pushed this lever, it would dispense food. So, I mean, they became very content rats very quickly, because they knew all they had to do was push that lever and they could get all the food they wanted. What a gig, you know? They took those rats and they attached electrodes to their brains. And they stimulated the electrodes to give them a little charge of electricity. And the reaction is comparable to what humans would describe as an orgasm. Now, they rigged it where the rats, if they push this lever, could stimulate their brain and therefore have an orgasm. Well, it didn't take the rats long at all, and they're pushing that lever. Now, rats love food. Let's give them a dilemma. You can have all the food you want or all the orgasms you want. Time and time again, the rats nearly starved themselves to death, picking this over this. It's a very powerful, very influential part of the brain. Corpus callosum, I've already showed you the corpus callosum, but I'll show you again. It's really it's really a very distinct area of the brain, very easy to identify. It's a wide band of tissue that connects the hemispheres at the forebrain level. It connects the hemispheres at the forebrain level, but not only that, it's a communication bridge. It's a communication bridge. Now, there were 2 doctors who had a patient that had epilepsy. Now, these doctors were very sharp. They were on top of all the protocol, and they were trying everything they could to control this guy's seizures, because he was having repeated seizures, too many, too close. Now, I don't know if you all know that much about seizures, but what used to be called a grand mal seizure, where it involves the entire body, it's very hard on a body physiologically. And if you have too many of them too close, it becomes a life-threatening situation. Well, that's what this patient was entering into. He was having too many seizures in too short of time. They tried medication, they had tried everything they knew, nothing was working. They were debating with each other, they were picking each other's brains, they were brainstorming, and nothing was coming up. And one of them finally said, I wonder if the seizure is starting on one part of the brain and traveling over to the other part and causing the entire brain to siege. And so they talked about that, and he said, you know, if that is what it is, why don't we cut the corpus callosum? And that will cut off the ability to communicate with the other side. Well, it hadn't been done. They talked to the patient, and they basically said, we've done everything we know to do. This has never been done before, but you can't go on having seizures. We don't know what else to do. And so he gave permission. They cut the corpus callosum, they severed it, and sure enough, the seizure stopped. Well, that opened up all kinds of things. First of all, realizing that the communication is afforded through the corpus callosum, at least part of it. And that, another thing is, through this, people started wondering about what does the right brain do and what does the left brain do? And so it started opening up questions, and people started trying to figure out ways to identify the functions of the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. You've got a structure called the anterior cingulate gyrus, or cortex. This surrounds the corpus callosum. Now, it has functions. Cognitive flexibility. It gives you the ability to shift attention, to correct errors that you have made, to be able to go from idea to idea, to jump, to see options that are before you, to be able to be cooperative and to go with the flow. All these things are associated with the anterior gyrus, anterior cingulate. But if it's damaged, you get stuck in your thinking. It'll as you are in an idea, you'll have more difficulty shifting to another idea. You'll have a tendency to worry, to hold grudges. You'll probably obsess more. It'll be easier for you to form compulsions and addictions. Well, now we talk about the limbic system. It's involved mainly in memory and emotion. Now, you have a structure called the amygdala. The amygdala. This structure has a lot to do with emotions, has a lot to do with regulating aggression. But remember when I told you that the sense of smell does not go through the thalamus? That's because its pathway takes it through the amygdala. And something very special happens. The amygdala will glue a memory with an emotion with a smell together. A memory, emotion, and a smell. So, if you come into a house and you smell apple pie and you say, oh, that smells just like my grandma's apple pie. oh, that was so good, and, you know, I remember that time that she let me help her make that apple pie. We just laughed, and she was just such a neat lady. And you're sitting here, and you're getting all kinds of warm, happy thoughts just from that odor of apple pie. Or a guy walking someplace and he smells Old Spice, and he said, my granddad used to use Old Spice. And then all of a sudden he flashes back to a memory where they went fishing one day. And that was a very special time, and he bonded with his granddad more, and they just had the best time. Memory, emotion, and smell. But it's not always a happy thing. Say a woman walking down the hall and she smells something and she has sexual abuse. And that odor reminds her, whether, you know, it might be the aftershave of somebody, and all of a sudden she just gets terrified. Or she goes into a panic attack. Or she gets very angry. Well, that's because that bad memory also got stuck with an odor and an emotion. So it can work both ways. Now the hippocampus, it's responsible for recent memory. If it gets damaged, you're going to have a hard time with short-term memory. Okay? There's the singular gyrus. But here is the brain. Now this is where they have taken a hemisphere, an entire half of the brain, and they've sliced it this way, taken the top off of it, and we're looking down into the interior of the brain here. Here is the amygdala, hippocampus, hippocampus, amygdala. Well, there's an outer part of the hemispheres that's called the cerebral cortex. We've already talked about how the halves of the brains are called hemispheres. If you look at a brain, it looks like it's got little ridges and valleys. The valleys are called sulci, and the ridges are called gyri. Okay? Now we've talked about areas of the brain. Now let's talk about lobes. Now with the lobes, you've got your frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. The frontal we call the motor cortex, because it's got a lot to do with our motor skills. The parietal area, that's this area right up in here. That has to do with the touch, pain, and temperature. Sight is back here. That's vision. That's the occipital. And then the temporal is right above your ears, and it's hearing. That one's the easy one to remember because you've got your ears and you've got your hearing, and that's the temporal lobe. Now, we talked about phrenology at the first of the semester, and how back in the 1800s they try and figure out different things about your brain by feeling the lumps and the dents and the bumps and all that. Well, they had the right idea, but they didn't go deep enough, because we do know that there are certain things that are located in certain places on the brain. And where they were attributing it to the skull, if they knew what we know now, we know it's not the skull, it's the brain that has the different places of functions. Okay, each hemisphere has these lobes. frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital, and the temporal. The cerebellum is not a lobe. This looks like the left hemisphere. The frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. The motor cortex, well, you've got your frontal lobes that are involved with many things. One of the things, though, is movement. And because it deals with movement and the other lobes do not, it is called the motor cortex. It's in the motor cortex, the frontal lobes, motor cortex. Now, you've got prefrontal cortex that needs to be talked about, and there are functions of the prefrontal cortex. It gives us our ability to focus on things, to have forethought about things, to control impulses. It also helps in organization, planning, and judgment, empathy, and insight. If the prefrontal cortex gets damaged, then you will have a shortened attention span. You might become impulsive. You might tend to procrastinate, have poor judgment, a lack of empathy, or a lack of insight. Now, because the parietal has to do with touch, temperature, pain, the occipital has to do with vision, and the temporal has to do with hearing, we group those together and say that that's the sensory cortex. Okay? Temporal lobes, their function, in addition to hearing, help us to understand language. It's involved with our long-term memory, the auditory processing, mood stability, temper control, and reading social cues. If there are problems with the temporal lobes, it can result in emotional instability, memory problems, feelings of panic and aggression, headaches, and learning problems. Now, you've got the lobes that have to do with sensory functions grouped together, and then you've got your motor lobe, or your motor function is in the frontal lobe. So where do you put things that aren't really sensory or motor functions? Called the association cortex. Language would not fit in sensory, and it's not really motor functions, nonverbal skills, and so these are two of the things that are put in the association cortex. When we're talking about language, there was a doctor named Paul Broca. Now, Broca had a patient that was a terminal patient. As he declined, his language got more and more limited. And pretty soon, there was only one word that he could say, and that was tan. Well, would you like me to fluff your pillows? Tan. Are you thirsty? Tan. You want me to change the channel? Tan. I don't even know if that applied, but you know. Are you cold? Tan. Everything was just a response of tan. Well, the hospital started nicknaming him Tan. And when Tan died, Dr. Broca did an autopsy on him. And in doing the autopsy, he found that there was a part of the left frontal hemisphere that was damaged. He suspected that that must have been a language area. When he wrote a paper, he identified that as the suspected language area. Later, it was verified, and because he was the first one that wrote a paper saying, I think this is an area of language, they actually named that spot Broca's area. That red spot right there is Broca's area. It is a language area, has a lot to do with language. Then there is another area called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area. The reason I bring this to your attention, it is very, very, very susceptible to damage due to abuse of alcohol. If you drink heavy enough and long enough, it can cause permanent brain damage, and it can affect your language, it can affect your processing of language, all kinds of problems. And once it's damaged, it can't be repaired. It's damaged for good. Well, there's a thing called nonverbal skills that also is under the association cortex. And if you have a deficit in nonverbal skills, it is called apraxia. Now, an example of a nonverbal skill, dressing. You know, we take dressing for granted. You know, okay, we'll just get up and get dressed, no problem. And if something changes where it interferes, you all of a sudden realize how we've been taking this for granted. I broke my thumb one time, and I had it in a big splint, and I couldn't use it to tie shoes. I couldn't use it to button things. I couldn't use it to eat. And all of a sudden, it just dawned on me how much I take for granted. Those little things like that. You know, I couldn't tie my shoes, so I had to get some Velcro shoes that you tighten up and you know, cinch the strap up. But these nonverbal skills, so many of them we take for granted, and yet when something happens, it can really get your attention. Apraxia is deficit in nonverbal skills. Now, on Tuesday, we are going to start the unit on what causes the most brain damage in adults, and that's a stroke. It's not Alzheimer's, it's a stroke. And this is something that when I was an EMT instructor, I taught about strokes. It's something that, for lack of a better word, I enjoy. This is one of my favorite things to teach. But one of the big reasons is because I know it can help you. I know it is, it's a good thing for you. I had a student come up a year or so after she finished my class, and she told me that because of something that she had learned in my lecture on strokes, that she was sure that was responsible for her grandmother pulling through a stroke. And so it's something that's near and dear to me. My mother had a stroke, my dad had a stroke, but hopefully it'll give you some kind of information that'll help you along and help you understand this better. Anybody got any questions?
What do you consider the main reasoning in strokes occurring? Like, what's the main reasoning for strokes? Is it stress? Is it thinking too much?